Today's shock inflation figures made instant fools of two ministers, especially in the Albanese government. First, of course, most obviously, Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Just this morning, Chalmers was trotting out one of his favourite lines, one of the government's favourite slogans.
The cheapest form of new energy is renewable energy.
Well, just hours later, lunchtime today, the Reserve Bank told the shocking truth. Electricity prices had just gone up 37.1%. I better repeat that. In fact, I'll put up a big graphic to underline just how incredible this is. Electricity prices up 37.1% in just the past year, on top of all the previous rises. And that is under the Albanese government's net zero schemes. Chalmers this morning also boasted about this government easing your cost of living.
Providing the cost of living relief that people need and deserve when they're under pressure.
Again, the Reserve Bank, just hours later, made that boast look like a lie. In fact, almost every basic of the cost of living has just gone way up. Food, clothing, and especially housing up nearly 6%. And then the electricity, of course, soaring after the rebates that state governments gave people to ease the pain of these power prices ran out. Overall, annual inflation jumped to 3.8%, up from 3.6% last month, more than expected. Meanwhile, underlying inflation also went up to 3.3%, meaning there's now virtually no chance of a cut of interest rates for another year. In fact, I've got to say, analysts now are saying they might even go up. And that's after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese claimed back in July, inflation under his wonderful government had turned a corner.
In the last Parliament, we confronted global inflation and we have turned the corner there with inflation down to within the Reserve Bank band. We have had 2 interest rate decreases. We are seeing real wages increase. We are seeing income taxes decrease so that people can earn more and keep more of what they earn.
How wrong he was. Inflation has not turned a corner, it's going up, and we are now moving to the worst of economic worlds. Low growth and high inflation under a high spending and high taxing government that's now promising a decade of deficits to add to the $1 trillion gross debt. And you can add our disastrously low productivity, which was made worse by this union-pandering government's new rules. Altogether, Australia is now facing a long, slow decline in our standard of living. Today's news gave Opposition Leader Susan Lee the chance to extend her recent string of good performances in Parliament. And she didn't miss, leading off this time with this opening salvo against the Prime Minister, who again dodged any responsibility for this terrible economic news.
The Prime Minister promised the Australian people that we had turned the corner on inflation. Today's numbers show that Australians were misled. Prime Minister, why do Australians have to pay the price for Labor's economic failure?
When it comes to inflation, we also know that the work is never done, which is why my government is very focused on cost of living measures and on putting that downward pressure on inflation. Now, when you have the withdrawal of state energy subsidies, you were always going to get a lift.
I should add something to that. You heard Albanese blame the extraordinary jump in inflation on the electricity prices. Well, the state governments, he said, they just took off the energy rebates. Well, the electricity prices weren't the only driver of the high inflation, and we wouldn't have needed to have those electricity rebates in the first place if the Albanese government had delivered on its promise that its net zero policies would actually cut your electricity bills by $275.
Reducing power prices by $275 for cheaper electricity. It will save families $275 on average a year. Households will benefit by $275.
Nor can we keep letting the government get away with this line from Albanese today and Jim Chalmers earlier, that if this inflation figure is bad, inflation under the Liberals was worse.
If those opposite are deeply concerned about inflation with a 3 in front of it, they must have been devastated when it had a 6 in front of it, which is what it had when they were in office.
What Albanese always fails to add is that 4 years ago, Australia was booming out of the pandemic lockdowns, and governments had been spending hand over fist to keep businesses afloat and Australians in jobs, and inflation all over the world was high. Anyway, after 3.5 years of Labor in power, isn't it time that it just owned up to whatever is happening now? But as I said, 2 ministers in particular should be embarrassed by today's figures. Chalmers was one. The other is Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen, who's just returned from the United Nations Climate Conference in Brazil with a brand new title, UN President for Climate Negotiations. Now, Bowen is the man whose job is to cut electricity prices, who promised to cut electricity prices, but today delivered the opposite. And to remind you again just how opposite, electricity prices not down but up another 37% in just the past year, which is no wonder heavy industries are closing. And it was so symbolic that even the lights in Parliament failed today.
Already, Australians have saved $1.9 billion at the pharmacy counter because of our cheaper medicines measures. Pensioners have received...
Members on my left will cease interjecting.
Now the opposition rubbed it in by offering the government the lights on their phones to cope with all these power troubles. How kind of them. But seriously, Energy Minister Chris Bowen has failed, and I have a question for him. How can President Bowen of the United Nations spare a minute for his new job overseas when he's presiding over this explosion in electricity prices at home? Fix up the mess here first. But what a government, eh? 3.5 years in power, and this is what they've created?